There is a specific kind of humiliation that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. It arrives quietly, in a smirk held a half-second too long, in the way a room full of educated people look at someone they've already decided doesn't belong there. Grant Mercer walked into that conference room at 32 years old with 7 years of self-taught knowledge, a warehouse uniform still creased into his muscle memory, and a 7-year-old boy waiting at home who believed his father could do anything. He walked out 4 minutes later with nothing but the sound of laughter following him down the hall. What those executives didn't know, what CEO Elena Hart, sitting silently at the end of that table, had quietly noticed, was that the man they just dismissed would be the only person capable of saving everything they'd spent years building. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me until the end. You won't regret it. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., same as always, and Grant Mercer lay there for exactly 4 seconds before his brain caught up with his body. He didn't hit snooze. He hadn't hit snooze in 3 years, not since Owen started waking up at 6 and asking questions that required full sentences. The boy had an uncanny radar for whether his father was actually present or just physically in the room, and Grant had learned early that half-asleep answers got followed up with 15 minutes of skeptical follow-up questions that were somehow harder to dodge than the originals. He sat up, rolled his neck. The left side cracked twice. The same 2 spots every morning, a percussion section that had become so routine he barely noticed it anymore. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had probably been considered decent in the late 90s and had since settled into a kind of tired dignity. The hallway carpet outside their door was faded to an indeterminate brown. The elevator worked maybe 60% of the time. The radiator in the bedroom made a sound like someone dragging furniture at 3 in the morning. But the windows in the living room faced east, and in the mornings the light came through clean and flat and honest, and Grant had decided years ago that this counted for something. He showered in 8 minutes, dressed, started coffee, pulled Owen's lunch ingredients from the refrigerator and began assembling them with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had performed this task so many times it no longer required conscious thought. Turkey on wheat. The crust cut off on 2 sides only, because Owen had recently decided that crust was acceptable on some sides, but not others, and Grant had not yet figured out the internal logic governing this rule, but had learned that violating it resulted in a lunch that came home uneaten. Apple slices, because Owen would eat an entire apple if it was cut, but would refuse to bite into a whole one, a preference Grant found baffling but had long since stopped questioning. A small bag of pretzels. A juice box. A folded piece of notebook paper with a drawing on it, because 3 months ago Grant had started tucking a small sketch into Owen's lunch, and the boy had started saving them in a shoebox under his bed. And this had become the kind of thing neither of them talked about, but both of them counted on. Today's drawing was a rocket ship, rough and fast, with a small figure visible in the window. Grant had labeled it Captain O in tiny block letters along the hull. He folded it, tucked it between the apple slices and the pretzels, and closed the lunchbox. Mas. Owen appeared at 6:04 dragging a stuffed elephant named Gerald by one worn ear, his hair pressed flat on one side and wild on the other in a way that defied gravity, in a manner Grant had genuinely never fully understood. Dad. Hey, buddy. Is today the day you have the interview? Grant paused with the coffee mug halfway to his mouth. Yeah, today's the day. Owen climbed onto the kitchen stool and propped his chin in both hands, studying his father with the particular gravity that 7-year-olds deploy when they've decided something is important. Are you nervous? A little. How nervous? Like roller coaster nervous or dentist nervous? Grant considered this more seriously than the question probably warranted. Somewhere in between. Roller coaster nervous is okay, Owen said, with the confidence of someone delivering a verdict. That kind of nervous means it's exciting. Dentist nervous means something bad might actually happen. Where'd you hear that? I made it up. That's actually pretty smart. Owen shrugged, already reaching for the cereal box. I know. Grant watched him for a moment, the casual certainty of him, the absolute absence of self-doubt, and felt the familiar combination of pride and something that sat in his chest like a stone. This kid. This impossible, wonderful kid who had come into the world 4 weeks early during the worst year of Grant's life and had somehow managed to be the reason that year didn't break him completely. Owen's mother, Dana, had left when Owen was 18 months old. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no screaming fight, no single catastrophic moment. She had simply become someone who found motherhood and the life they'd built together less interesting than she'd anticipated. And she had left in stages, first emotionally, then physically. Until one morning, Grant woke up and she was gone, and Owen was in his crib calling out in that particular two-syllable cry that meant he was wet and hungry and wondering where everyone was. Grant had stood in the kitchen of their then apartment for a long time, holding a note that said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this," and he had thought about a lot of things. Then he had gone and changed Owen's diaper and made a bottle and sat down in the rocking chair they'd bought at a second-hand shop, and he had understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever happened next would be entirely up to him. He had never finished college. He dropped out after 2 years when the money ran out and the part-time job stopped being enough, and the math had simply stopped working. He told himself he'd go back. He hadn't gone back. Life had developed opinions about this plan. For the next few years, he'd moved through a series of jobs: a line cook, a delivery driver, a moving company laborer, that paid enough to keep Owen in shoes and the lights on, but not much more. And then he'd gotten the warehouse job, which paid 15% better than anything else he could find without a degree, and he'd taken it, and he'd stayed in it because it came with a predictable schedule and predictable paychecks, and Owen needed predictability more than he needed any particular version of his father's ambition. But the nights had belonged to Grant. After Owen went to sleep, after the dishes were done, and the lunch was packed for the next day, and the apartment was as quiet as a fourth-floor apartment in a building full of other people ever got, Grant sat at the second-hand laptop on the kitchen table, and he studied. He had started with YouTube tutorials, basic spreadsheet functions, elementary statistics, intro to Python. He had bookmarked the free course catalogs of 4 different universities and worked through them methodically, spending more time on the sections that confused him and less time on the ones that didn't, building something in his head that had no official name and no credential attached to it, but that felt slowly and then more quickly like genuine competence. He discovered he had a particular aptitude for pattern recognition, for looking at a data set the way other people might look at a landscape, not as individual points, but as shapes, as flows, as a system with its own internal logic that revealed itself if you were patient and methodical and willing to sit with confusion long enough for it to become clarity. He didn't know what to call what he was building. He only knew it felt like the most honest thing about himself. The job posting had appeared 8 weeks ago on a general employment site, buried 3 pages deep under listings for administrative assistants and retail supervisors. Senior Data Specialist, Heartline Technologies. Candidates should demonstrate advanced analytical capability across complex datasets, experience with systems architecture and data classification, strong problem-solving skills under pressure. The salary listed was 4 times what Grant made at the warehouse. He had stared at the posting for a long time. Then he had closed the laptop. Then he had opened it again 20 minutes later and started working on the application. He knew, rationally, that he was probably not what they were looking for. He had no degree, no official title, no LinkedIn profile with a list of certifications under his name. What he had was 3 years of self-directed study, a dozen completed online courses with no accreditation weight behind them, and a private folder on his laptop containing 15 data analysis projects he'd done purely for himself, pulling publicly available data sets and working through them at midnight, writing up findings that no one would ever read. He sent the application anyway. He hadn't expected to hear back. When the email came, Heartline Technologies would like to invite you for an interview, he read it 3 times. Then he went into Owen's room, where the boy was asleep with Gerald tucked under his arm, and he stood there in the dark for a moment, feeling something he couldn't exactly name. The Heartline Technologies headquarters occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that communicated its own importance through sheer reflective surface area. Grant stood outside it for a moment before going in. He was wearing the best thing he owned, a dark gray blazer he'd bought 2 years ago for his friend Marcus's wedding and had worn exactly once since, pressed dress pants, a white shirt. He'd polished his shoes the night before while Owen sat at the table doing homework, asking questions about why shoes needed polishing in the first place, and whether there was a scientific reason or if it was just something people did because other people did it. Grant had said he'd get back to him on that. The lobby was marble and glass, and the sound of his shoes on the floor was louder than he wanted. The receptionist was professional and efficient and pointed him toward the elevator without looking up from her screen more than once. The conference room on the 28th floor had a long table and 8 chairs and a view of the city that probably functioned as its own form of intimidation. Look how far up we are. Look how small everything below us seems. Grant sat in the chair indicated and waited, and while he waited, he looked at the view and thought about Owen's rocket ship drawing in his son's lunchbox at school right now, and about the loan on the laptop, still $60 from paid off. They came in 4 minutes late as a group. 2 men and a woman, all in that specific kind of business casual that signals enough confidence not to need a full suit. The older of the 2 men, heavy-set, mid-50s, a face that had settled into permanent mild disapproval, carried a tablet and sat down first. His name, according to the business card slid across the table, was Director Lawrence Pruitt, head of systems operations. The woman, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, introduced herself as Patricia Chen, head of talent acquisition. The younger man, maybe 38, trim, the kind of person who had clearly decided at some point that the best strategy was permanent controlled pleasantness, was Devin Marsh, senior operations manager. And then, last, rolling to the head of the table in a sleek black wheelchair, was the person Grant recognized from the company website, Elena Hart, CEO. 30 years old, though she looked younger in photographs and somehow precisely 30 in person. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, her dark hair pulled back cleanly, and she had the quality that Grant had read about in profile pieces on her. A composed attention, an absence of the performed busyness that most executives seem to cultivate as a kind of armor. She looked at him as she positioned herself at the head of the table, and her expression gave away nothing, which Grant found more unsettling than open skepticism would have been. "Mr. Mercer," Patricia Chen said, opening a folder. "Thank you for coming in. Thank you for having me. We've reviewed your application." A pause that lasted a beat longer than necessary. "I'll be honest, your background is somewhat unusual for a senior-level position." "I know. You don't have a degree." "I don't." Lawrence Pruitt glanced down at the tablet with an expression that suggested he had already formed his conclusion and was present mostly as a formality. "You list your current employer as Cedar Field Logistics. That's right?" "A warehouse." "Yes." Another pause. This one had a specific texture to it, not quite contemptuous but trending in that direction. "And yet you're applying for a senior specialist role that typically requires a minimum of a bachelor's degree in computer science, information systems, or a related field, plus 3 to 5 years of documented professional experience," Pruitt said. He wasn't asking a question. He was reading a prepared statement. "I understand the requirements listed," Grant said. "I believe my skills are directly relevant to the position. I brought work samples. Independent analyses I've completed, if you'd like to." "Let me ask you something." Pruitt set the tablet down. "What exactly makes you think you're qualified for a senior data specialist position at a company like Heartline?" The question was delivered with the particular brand of condescension that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. It was the tone of a person explaining something obvious to someone who should have understood it without needing it explained. Grant felt his jaw tighten. He kept his voice even. "Because I've spent the last 3 years teaching myself data analytics, systems architecture, and classification modeling at an advanced level. I've completed over 20 independent projects, including a predictive analysis of supply chain failure patterns using publicly available logistics data that I'd be happy to walk you through. I can identify data anomalies most people miss because I came to this field differently than most people did. I didn't learn it in a classroom, which means I didn't learn the assumptions that come with a classroom. I see the data without the filter." Silence. Then Devin Marsh cleared his throat, glancing sideways at Pruitt with an expression that was almost but not quite a smile. And then Pruitt laughed. It wasn't a full laugh. It was the half-laugh of a man who finds something too absurd for full amusement, a compressed exhale through the nose that communicated you're joking without the effort of saying the words. Marsh followed a half-second behind, a practiced echo, the kind of laugh that checks which way the wind is blowing before committing. "A warehouse worker," Pruitt said, not even addressing Grant directly anymore, more talking to the room, "who taught himself data analytics at night and thinks that qualifies him for senior specialist." Grant looked at him. I don't think it's funny, Grant said. His voice was quieter than before, which he hadn't planned. I spent 3 years building this while working 12-hour shifts and raising my son alone. I came here because I thought I had something worth showing you. If I'm wrong about that, I'll leave. But I don't think I'm wrong. The silence that followed had a different quality. Patricia Chen was looking down at the folder. Pruitt had shifted in his chair, not quite embarrassed, not quite willing to be. Marsh had stopped smiling, and Elena Hart, who had not spoken a single word since sitting down, was looking at Grant with an expression he couldn't read. Not sympathy, not condescension, not the polite neutrality of someone waiting for a meeting to end. Something attentive, something that was taking in more than the surface. She said nothing. I think we have what we need, Patricia Chen said, in the professionally warm tone of someone closing a door. We'll be in touch. Grant stood. He gathered his folder of work samples, the folder nobody had asked to see, and he pushed in his chair and walked out of the conference room, and the sound of his own footsteps on the floor felt very loud in his own ears. And it was only when he was in the elevator, doors closed, that he let out the breath he'd been holding since Pruitt laughed. His hands, he noticed, were not shaking. He wasn't sure if that was strength or just numbness, but he decided to count it as strength because Owen was going to ask him how it went, and he needed to have an answer that wasn't terrible. The elevator opened into the lobby, and he walked out of the building into the flat autumn light, and the city moved around him at its ordinary pace, taxis and pedestrians and the ambient machinery of a place indifferent to individual disappointment, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and took inventory of himself. He was 32 years old. He had a warehouse shift starting in 4 hours. He had a son who would be off the school bus at 3:15 and who would want to hear about the roller coaster versus dentist's nervous assessment. He had a laptop with $60 still on the loan and 3 years of midnight studying behind him that had just been dismissed in under 4 minutes by a man who had never had to choose between ambition and rent. He started walking toward the subway. He did not let himself think, in that moment, about the CEO who had sat at the head of the table and watched him walk out without saying a word. He did not yet have a way to understand what her silence had meant, or hadn't meant. He filed it away in the same general folder as the rest of the morning. Things that didn't go the way you hoped. And he walked. Owen was waiting on the front steps when Grant came home from his afternoon shift at 6:53. Still in his jacket, Gerald sitting beside him on the step with a kind of solemn moral support. "How'd it go?" he asked before Grant had reached the bottom of the stairs. Grant sat down beside him. The concrete was cold through his pants. "Honestly, not great." Owen processed this. Dentist nervous or roller coaster nervous? Definitely dentist. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you show them your stuff, the analysis things?" "They didn't ask to see them." Another pause. "That's dumb," Owen said, with the flat certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to soften judgments. "Yeah," Grant said. "Maybe a little." "You're really good at the analysis things." "I know." "Did you tell them that?" "I tried." "Did they listen?" Grant looked at his son. At the serious face, the absolute conviction, the total absence of any framework that would allow for the possibility that the people in the room might be right about this. "Not really," he said. Owen frowned at Gerald, as if the elephant was responsible. Then he looked back up at Grant. "Did you find the rocket ship drawing?" Grant had forgotten about that for a moment and now remembered. "That was for your lunch. Did you—" "I saved it." Owen patted his jacket pocket. "Captain O had a good mission today. He went to Jupiter." "How was Jupiter?" "Cold and windy, but interesting." Owen stood up and picked up Gerald by the ear. "I'm hungry." "I know. Let's go up." "Dad?" "Yeah." "They're wrong." Grant looked at him. Owen was already heading up the stairs, Gerald swinging. "I know, buddy." He stood there for a moment longer on the cold concrete, looking at nothing in particular, and then he followed his son inside. That night, after Owen was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Grant sat at the kitchen table and opened the laptop and stared at the folder of analyses he'd brought to the interview and never shown anyone. He thought about Pruitt's laugh. He thought about Devon Marsh's quick checking echo of it. He thought about Patricia Chen's folder and her professional warmth, and the way she had said we'll be in touch in the exact tone people use when they mean something else entirely. And he thought, He couldn't stop himself. About Elena Hart. About the way she'd positioned herself at the head of a table full of people who were, without saying it directly, treating her as peripheral, consulting her presence while managing the actual discussion around her. About the fact that she had run this company for 2 years and built it into what it was, and sat there while her own senior director laughed at a candidate in a job interview. About the way she had looked at him when he said, "I don't think it's funny." He didn't know what that had meant. He closed the laptop and went to bed. Otam. The call came 9 days later. Grant was on a loading dock at the warehouse, annotating a shipment manifest, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number, city prefix. He stepped away from the dock. Grant Mercer. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, efficient and precise. This is Diane, executive assistant to Elena Hart at Heartline Technologies. Ms. Hart would like to speak with you. She's available this afternoon at 3, if that works for you. He stood there on the loading dock with the manifest in one hand and his phone in the other, and the sounds of the warehouse moving around him, forklifts, pallets, the PA system announcing dock assignments, and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm at work right now." "Did you say Elena Hart?" "That's correct." "The CEO?" "Yes." "About the data specialist position. I'm not at liberty to say more than that she'd like to speak with you. Can I confirm 3 o'clock? He worked out the math on his shift. He would need to swap the last 2 hours. "Yes," he said. 3 o'clock works." He stood on the dock for another moment after hanging up. Then he went to find his floor supervisor about the shift swap, and he was careful, very careful, not to let his face do anything particular about this, because he had been in the interview room 9 days ago, and he knew how that had gone, and he was not going to let himself build something on the possibility of a phone call that might mean nothing at all. He was careful about this all the way up until he turned the corner into the break room, which was empty, and then he stopped and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and stood there for a moment feeling something complicated and electric move through him. 9 days. She had called 9 days later. He didn't know what that meant yet, but something in him. The part that recognized patterns, that had always recognized patterns, that had pulled signal from noise since before he even knew that was what he was doing. Something in him was already paying attention. Check. He didn't tell Owen that night. He didn't let himself think about it too much. Didn't open it up and examine it the way he wanted to, because he had done that before with things that turned out to be nothing, and the drop afterward was harder than the anticipation was worth. Instead, he helped Owen with a math worksheet, mixed fractions, which Owen approached with the same systematic skepticism he brought to most new information. And he cooked pasta with the jarred marinara sauce that Owen preferred to the homemade version for reasons Grant had decided were too irrational to interrogate, and he read 2 chapters of the book they were working through together before lights out. He sat on the edge of Owen's bed after the boy fell asleep, the way he sometimes did, not doing anything, just sitting there in the low light, listening to the easy rhythm of his son's breathing. He thought about the interview. He thought about the laugh. He thought about sitting in this same kitchen 3 years ago at 1 in the morning, a free online course on Python basics open on the laptop screen, Owen asleep in the next room, the radiator making its furniture-dragging sound, everything around him suggesting that this was what his life was, and him deciding anyway, stubborn, and probably a little stupid about it, to build something different inside the borders of that life. He thought about Elena Hart sitting at the head of that table, watching. He got up quietly and went back to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee he didn't need, and sat with it in the eastward-facing living room that got good light in the mornings. He would go to the meeting tomorrow. He would see what it was. He would not allow himself to want anything from it until he understood what it was. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. The radiator made its sound. Somewhere down the hall, someone's television was a low murmur through the wall. Grant sat with his coffee and the dark window and waited for morning and whatever morning would bring. He didn't sleep much, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the quality of the wakefulness. Not anxious, not turning things over restless, but something quieter. Alert. The kind of attention his mind went to when it was working on something real, something that had actual shape and weight to it. He lay in the dark and thought about the data specialist job description, about what senior meant at a company like Heartline, about the systems architecture problems implicit in a technology company that had grown as fast as Heartline had grown in the past 3 years. The failure modes that kind of growth always generated. Seams in the data infrastructure where old systems had been patched into new ones. Classification errors that accumulated in exactly the way sediment accumulated, slowly and invisibly, until the weight of it was enough to cause something structural. He thought about this in the abstract, the way he always thought about data problems, not as theoretical exercises, but as actual systems with actual behaviors, things that could be mapped and understood if you looked at them the right way. He thought about it until his alarm went off at 5:47. Then he got up and made Owen's lunch, and the rocket ship in today's note had a second figure next to the first one, and he labeled it Captain G, and he folded it and put it in the lunchbox without making any particular decision to. He just did it, the same way he had done everything else for the past 3 years. One day, and then the next, and then the next. Owen noticed the second figure at breakfast. He looked at it for a long moment. Captain G, he read. Yeah. That's you? I thought maybe. Owen looked up at him, and for a moment his face was very open, unguarded in the way kids' faces are when they haven't thought to defend themselves from a feeling yet. I like it, he said. Good. Dad. Yeah. You should bring your analysis folder to the meeting today. Grant had not told him there was a meeting. He stopped. What makes you say that? Owen shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone who is trying not to admit they've been paying more attention than they let on. You ironed your shirt again. Grant looked down at the shirt. Go brush your teeth, he said. Owen went, but he was smiling, and Grant picked up the coffee cup and stood at the counter and thought, yeah, I should probably bring the folder. He brought the folder. The meeting was in a different room this time, smaller, less theatrical, no panoramic view designed to establish hierarchical distance. A round table with 4 chairs. A whiteboard on one wall with dry erase markers in a tray. The kind of room where things actually get worked out rather than performed. Elena Hart was already there when Grant was shown in. She was alone. She extended a hand across the table and Grant shook it, and her grip was direct and unhesitant, and she gestured toward the chair across from her. Thank you for coming back, she said. Thank you for calling. A beat. She looked at him steadily and up close without the long conference table between them and the presence of the other 3. He could see the quality of her attention more clearly. That composed focus, the sense that she was registering more than she was letting onto her face. I want to apologize for how the interview went, she said. He hadn't expected that. You don't need to, I do. Simple. Not performing apology, just stating it. Lawrence's behavior was inappropriate. I should have said something at the time. I didn't. That was a failure of leadership on my part, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. The directness of it was disarming. Grant held it for a moment. Why did you call me? He asked. Because I read your application 3 times, she said. Not the credentials section, the project descriptions, the analysis of supply chain failure patterns you mentioned. She tapped the folder on the table between them. She had a copy, he realized, printed. I pulled the dataset you referenced, and I ran your conclusions against current modeling software. You were right about all of it, and you found an additional failure mode that the software missed. He said nothing. You don't have a degree, she said. You have something harder to teach than a degree. She paused. I know what it feels like to walk into a room and watch people decide your peripheral before you've said a word. I've been doing that since I was 26. It changes the way you see things. She looked at him directly. I think it changed the way you see things, too. Grant looked at her across the round table, at this 30-year-old CEO who had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars from a wheelchair while her own board of directors probably questioned every decision twice as hard as they would have otherwise, and who had sat silently in that conference room while her senior director laughed at a warehouse worker, and who had then spent 9 days thinking about it and made a call. What are you offering? He said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. I'd like to show you something first, she said. She turned the laptop on the table toward him. It was a live system dashboard, feeds from multiple data streams, real-time, the kind of layered architecture that a company Heartline's size would be running in normal operations. And even at a glance, even without context, Grant could see it. A faint but consistent irregularity in the classification streams, a pattern in the error rates that didn't match any of the obvious explanations. Subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you were looking for something specific rather than looking at the whole system. He leaned forward. His hand moved toward the keyboard and then stopped. May I? Please. He started pulling the data. The folder sat on the table between them, unopened, and outside the window the city moved through its afternoon, and Grant Mercer, 32 years old, single father, self-taught, unwanted in this building 8 days ago, leaned over a laptop in a roundtable conference room and started showing the CEO of Heartline Technologies exactly what he saw. He spent 40 minutes with her laptop before either of them spoke again about anything other than the data. It wasn't that the conversation stopped, it shifted. The way conversations do when two people find a shared language and stop needing to negotiate the translation. Grant would pull a data stream and explain what he was seeing, and Elena would ask a question that cut directly to the relevant detail, no preamble, no performance of understanding she didn't have, and he would answer, and then she would be quiet for a moment, and then she'd say something that showed she'd not only followed it, but was already 2 steps ahead. She was sharp, genuinely sharp. Not the performed sharpness of someone who has learned to project competence, but the actual thing, the kind of mind that finds problems interesting rather than threatening. That classification irregularity, he said at one point, pointing to the pattern he'd noticed in the first 30 seconds. How long has that been present? Elena looked at the screen. The system log shows it starting about 6 weeks ago. Has anyone flagged it? 3 separate engineers looked at it. All 3 concluded it was minor. Background noise in a complex system. Grant kept his eyes on the screen. It's not background noise. No, she said. I didn't think it was either. A pause. Tell me why. He walked her through it. The way the irregularity appeared not randomly, but in a pattern tied to specific data input events. The way it was consistent enough to be systemic rather than incidental. The way it suggested something foundational rather than surface level. Elena listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the particular way of someone reorganizing something inside their head. The Arden contract, she said. I don't know what that is. A $20 million international systems project, our biggest current contract. It's been in execution phase for 4 months. She looked back at him. It started showing performance issues 3 weeks ago. We have a team of 8 engineers working around the clock to find the problem. The room was quiet. And they haven't found it, Grant said. No. He looked at the irregularity on the screen. At the pattern he'd seen in 30 seconds that 8 engineers had not found in 3 weeks. He was careful about what he said next, because he understood that the way he said it mattered, and not because of ego. I'd want to see the Arden system directly before I said anything definitive. I know, Elena said. That's why I called you. She offered him a temporary consulting assignment, 2 weeks, specific to the Arden project diagnostic, compensation that was more than he made in a month at the warehouse. She was straightforward about what it was and wasn't. No promise beyond the 2 weeks, no guarantee of anything further, but full access to the system and direct reporting to her rather than through the operations hierarchy. He asked her why she was bypassing her own hierarchy. She was quiet for a moment. Then, because my own hierarchy spent 3 weeks not finding it. He thought about Owen, about the school pickup schedule, about the cost of short-notice childcare. He thought about the warehouse shift supervisor who had been reasonably good about flexibility so far but had limits, like everyone did. I need the hours to be workable around a school schedule, he said. My son is 7. I do pick up at 3:15 every day. That's not negotiable. It doesn't need to be negotiated, she said. I'll have Diane set up a flexible access arrangement. He looked at her. Just like that? I've been running a technology company for 2 years, Elena said, with a dryness that wasn't unfriendly. I understand how to accommodate a school pickup. He took the assignment. Done. He told Owen that night after dinner, keeping it simple. A temporary work project, a different kind of job for a couple of weeks. Owen asked if it was at the place with the interview, and Grant said yes, and Owen said, the people who were wrong about you? And Grant said, let's call it complicated. And Owen accepted this with the practical flexibility of a kid who had learned that adults sometimes needed a little room around the accuracy of their statements. Will you still do pickup? Owen asked. Every day, same time. Owen nodded, satisfied, and went back to the drawing he was working on. A map of what appeared to be a planet with very specific geographic features, labeled in a combination of English and what Grant suspected was invented script. That night, at the kitchen table, long after Owen was asleep, Grant sat with the temporary access credentials Elena's assistant had sent and pulled up the Arden project system for the first time. He spent 3 hours with it. By midnight, he had confirmed what he suspected in Elena's office. The irregularity was not incidental. It was systemic. It was rooted somewhere deep in the classification architecture, and it was generating a cascade of small errors that were compounding over time in exactly the way a small crack in a foundation compounds. Invisibly, steadily, until the moment it doesn't. He wrote up 4 pages of notes. Not conclusions, observations. He had learned years ago that the distance between observation and conclusion was where most analytical errors lived. He closed the laptop at 12:40 and sat in the dark kitchen for a moment with the particular feeling he got when a problem started to become clear. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the specific tension of something coming into focus that wasn't yet focused, the sensation right before you see it. Whole. He went to bed. He dreamed about data streams, which he'd been told was unusual for someone who hadn't had a formal education in the field. He'd always thought this was backward. Data was just patterns, and his brain had been finding patterns since before he knew what to call it. The Heartline Operations Center occupied a quarter of the 26th floor, a large room full of workstations, wall-mounted displays showing live system status feeds, and the specific ambient intensity of a space where people had been working too hard for too long. Empty coffee cups on desks. A whiteboard covered in equations someone had half erased and restarted in a different color. The particular institutional smell of recycled air and collective stress. Grant arrived at 8 on his first morning with his laptop bag and a coffee he'd made at home and found the room at about 70% capacity. Engineers hunched at screens, a cluster of 3 in the far corner having a conversation that from across the room had the cadence of an argument they'd been having for several days. A woman met him at the door. Mid-30s, dark-rimmed glasses, the look of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and functional anger. Her name badge said Ria Nair, systems lead. "You're the consultant," she said. "Grant Mercer." She looked at him, at his bag, his coffee, his absence of a company badge, with an expression that wasn't hostile exactly, but wasn't warm either. "Elena told me you'd be coming in. She said to give you full system access. I appreciate it. She didn't tell me why." Ria's voice had an edge to it that wasn't personal, but wasn't nothing either. "We have 8 experienced engineers who've been on this system for 3 weeks. I know. And she brought in a consultant. I know," Grant said again. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she seemed to make some internal decision about the productive use of her energy. "What do you need?" "A workstation and access to the full Arden data logs going back to project initiation. Raw logs, not the processed summary feeds." Ria blinked. "The raw logs are about 40 gigabytes. I know, that's what I need." Another assessment. Then she nodded once and led him to an empty workstation near the window, away from the main cluster of engineers. He was aware of being watched as he set up. Peripheral glances, the kind that stop just before you turn to catch them. He understood this. A stranger arriving with direct CEO access and asking for raw data was a specific kind of professional intrusion, and these were people who had been grinding themselves down on an unsolved problem, and the unspoken question in the room was, who does this guy think he is? He kept his head down and started pulling data. The first 3 days were difficult in ways that had nothing to do with the data itself. The engineering team was civil, professional even, but there was a wall there, the invisible partition that forms in any group that has spent long enough under pressure and developed its own internal logic about the problem they're working on. They had theories Grant didn't have access to, historical context he was still building, and 3 weeks of accumulated conviction about where the solution was and wasn't. He sat in on 2 team meetings and said almost nothing in either. He asked questions when he needed to clarify something and was answered accurately, if not warmly. He ate lunch at his workstation and left when he needed to for pickup, and came back after Owen was settled for the evening and worked in the kitchen until well past midnight. Owen noticed the new schedule. He was careful not to say anything directly about it. He'd learned, with the particular adaptability of a kid raised by someone operating at a permanent stretch, when to give his father room. But he was quieter in the evenings, and he started sitting at the table with his own stuff while Grant worked, rather than watching TV in the living room. And Grant didn't address this directly, but moved his laptop to face the kitchen so Owen was in his line of sight. On the fourth day at Heartline, during a coffee run to the break room, Grant passed the cluster of 3 engineers whose argument he'd been watching from a distance all week. Up close, he could tell it was specifically about the failure hypothesis. 2 of them were convinced the problem was in the front-end data entry protocol. The third was convinced it was in the API integration layer. He poured his coffee and listened for a minute without intruding. If it's entry side, the error distribution would be random, the third one was saying. He was young, maybe 25, with the intensity of someone who was correct about something and was getting tired of having to be correct about it. His badge said James Kwan, data engineer. It's not random, it's patterned. Patterned errors come from systemic issues, not user behavior. The pattern could be explained by user habits, said the engineer across from him, a tall woman named Priya Desai, according to her badge. If specific users are making specific entry errors. We ran the user analysis 3 times. The error pattern doesn't correlate to any user cluster. It correlates weakly, Geet. Weakly is not the same as meaningfully, Kwan said, frustrated. Grant poured his coffee and said, without entirely planning to, "He's right." Both engineers looked at him. "The pattern is too consistent for user behavior origin," Grant said. "User behavior is variable. This isn't." He picked up his coffee. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt." He walked back to his workstation. Kwan appeared beside him 11 minutes later. "You've been looking at the raw logs," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah." "All of them?" "Getting there." Kwan pulled up a chair without being invited. "What are you seeing?" Grant hesitated for half a second, not because he didn't want to answer, but because he was being careful about the distance between observation and conclusion. "I'm not ready to say definitively, but the error pattern has a regularity that points to a classification-level issue rather than anything in the upper architecture layers." Kwan was quiet for a moment. "I said something similar in the Week 2 meeting. Pruitt told me I was wasting the team's time on a dead end." Grant said nothing. "He's convinced it's the API layer," Kwan continued. "He's been convinced since day 4, and he's been steering the team toward it ever since." "What does Rhea think?" "Rhea thinks Pruitt might be right, but she's not sure. She's running 2 parallel tracks, which is how you end up exhausted and spinning your wheels at the same time." Kwan looked at Grant's screen. "What specifically are you looking for in the raw logs?" "The classification schema applied at data ingestion. What categories the system is assigning to incoming data and whether those categories have drifted from the original specification." Kwan stared at him. "You think it's a classification drift issue?" "I think it might be. I'm not sure yet." "That would be, if it's classification drift, that would explain everything. Every single failure pattern we've been seeing would resolve from a single source error." "I know," Grant said. "That's why I'm being careful about concluding it before I'm sure." Kwan looked at him for another moment. Then he pulled his own laptop from under his arm and opened it. "Tell me what you need and I'll pull the comparative schema documentation. I know exactly where it is." The project continued to deteriorate while they worked. Grant heard this in pieces, from Kwan, who had become a kind of informal ally, and from fragments of conversations in the operations center that he absorbed without seeking out. The Arden system's performance issues were worsening by measurable increments each day. The client had made 2 formal inquiries. There was a deadline clause in the contract with significant financial exposure if the performance benchmarks weren't restored within a specific window that was now less than 3 weeks away. The pressure in the room had a different quality by the end of the first week. It had acquired weight, the specific heaviness of a team that was working hard and was afraid the work wasn't going to be enough. He saw Elena twice that week, briefly. Once in the hallway outside the operations center where she paused long enough to ask a direct question about his progress. He gave her an honest answer. He was building towards something, but wasn't there yet. She nodded once and moved on without pressing him, which he appreciated. The second time was in the elevator, just the 2 of them, heading in opposite directions at the end of a day. She looked tired, genuinely tired. Not the managed tiredness of a public face, but the actual weight of a person carrying more than they should probably be carrying alone. "How are you doing?" she asked, and it was a real question, not a pleasantry. "I'm okay," he said. "How are you?" A pause, with the quality of someone deciding how honest to be. "I've had better months." The elevator opened at his floor. "We're close," he said. "I think we're close." She looked at him. "I believe you." He got out. He said. What he hadn't told her yet, what he hadn't told anyone yet, was that he'd found something 4 days in that he'd been sitting with since, turning it over, checking it from different angles the way you check a structure you think might be compromised before you tell anyone because you want to be sure. The classification schema. Heartline's Arden system ingested data from multiple external sources and classified it before routing it to the appropriate processing streams. The classification rules had been set at project initiation 8 months ago. And somewhere in the 4th month, those rules had drifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, in small adjustments that had accumulated over time until the categories being applied to incoming data no longer matched the categories the downstream processing systems expected to receive. The data was going into the wrong boxes. Not all the data, maybe 15% of total volume, but it was the 15% that the critical performance functions depended on. It was the data that the system's most essential processes needed to function correctly, and it was being systematically misrouted, had been for weeks, and every solution the engineers had tried had been aimed at the symptoms rather than the source, because nobody had gone back far enough to look at the classification schema against the original specification. Grant had gone back far enough. He needed one more day to finish building the comparative map, the side-by-side documentation of what the schema was supposed to be versus what it had become, because he wanted to walk into that room with evidence, not just a theory, and he wanted the evidence to be complete. He wanted to be certain. He came home on a Thursday evening, picked up Owen from Marcus's apartment, where the boy had spent the afternoon. Marcus was his oldest friend, the only person from his life before single parenthood who had remained fully present rather than drifting to the periphery. And on the walk home, Owen slipped his hand into Grant's without announcing it, and Grant held it without making anything of it. "Are you figuring it out?" Owen asked. "Almost." "How will you know when you're all the way figured out?" Grant thought about this. "When I'm sure enough that I'd stake something on it." "Like what?" "Like my credibility? My reputation? What people think I'm worth." Owen walked quietly for a half block. "That seems like a lot." "It is," Grant said. "That's how you know it's real." They walked the rest of the way home without talking, and when they got to the apartment, Owen went to wash his hands, and Grant stood in the kitchen and set his laptop bag down and thought about the next morning. One more day. He was almost certain. He just needed to be sure. The thing about working in an environment where you're not fully trusted is that you notice after a while that the distrust is not entirely personal. Pruitt barely looked at him in team meetings, which was fine. Grant had stopped taking that particular form of social communication as meaningful information. But there was something else operating in the room that he'd been picking up on all week. Something that was about more than skepticism toward an outsider. Quan had said it plainly, late on Thursday night, when the two of them were the last ones in the operations center and the rest of the team had gone home to sleep. "Pruitt's not just wrong about the API layer," Quan said, staring at his screen. "He's invested in being right. There's a difference." Grant looked over. "What do you mean?" He told the executive team in week 1 that he'd identified the failure point. He told them it was the API integration. He's been building a case for that conclusion for 2 weeks. Quan pulled at the edge of a coffee cup that had been empty for an hour. If the actual problem turns out to be somewhere else, if it turns out to be something he didn't see and someone else found, that's not just an analytical error, that's a credibility problem. Grant thought about this. Does Elena know this? I don't know what Elena knows about Pruitt's internal positioning. I know she's under pressure from the board. I know the board has used the Arden situation to question her judgment twice in the last month. Quan paused. There are people in this company who would like to see her fail on this, not because the company failing is good for them, because she failing would open up certain conversations they've wanted to have. The operations center hummed around them with the ambient sound of running systems. Grant said nothing for a moment. You should know that, Quan said. Before you walk this finding into a room full of people, you should know what's operating. Grant appreciated the warning. He sat with it, set it aside, and went back to the comparative schema documentation. What he had found was what he had found. What other people wanted to be true was a separate matter entirely, and he had learned a long time ago. Sitting at a kitchen table at midnight in an apartment that needed new windows, with a kid asleep in the next room, that reality did not adjust itself to accommodate other people's preferences. The data was the data. He just needed one more day to prove it. He was at his workstation at 7:30 the following morning, 2 hours before the rest of the team arrived, and he worked with the focused economy of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and where it is and just needs the time to document it properly. By 9:45, he had it. 61 specific instances of classification divergence, each one documented with the original specification alongside the current applied rule, each one cross-referenced to a downstream failure event in the Arden Systems performance log. The pattern was unambiguous. He sat back in his chair. He looked at it for a long moment, the shape of it on the screen, the way it resolved from complexity into simplicity, the way the entire tangled weeks of failure and frustration and exhausted engineering reduced to a single, fixable, foundational error. He thought about Owen's question, how will you know when you're all the way figured out? When I'm sure enough that I'd stake something on it. He was sure. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Elena Hart's direct line, the number she'd given him on his first day with the instruction to use it without ceremony if he had something. I need 15 minutes with you before this morning's team meeting. I found it. Her reply came back in under 2 minutes. My office. Now. He closed the comparative analysis document, saved it to 3 separate locations out of a habit he'd developed doing this kind of work alone at a kitchen table, and picked up his laptop. Across the operations center, Ria Nair looked up from her workstation and their eyes met for a moment. He couldn't tell what she read in his face. He nodded once and walked toward the elevator. Behind him, he heard the room continuing its ordinary morning sounds, keyboards, a ringing phone, the hum of systems under load. In a few hours, one of those systems was going to stop failing. He didn't let himself feel too much about that yet. He'd learned to wait until the thing was actually done before he let himself feel anything about it. It was a rule he'd made for himself years ago, and it had served him well, and he kept it now as he stepped into the elevator and the doors closed and the floor numbers ticked upward one by one. Elena's office was on the 29th floor, one above the operations center, and it was smaller than Grant had expected for a CEO. Not cramped, but not the vast territorial display he'd anticipated. A desk with 2 monitors. A round meeting table near the window with 4 chairs. Bookshelves along one wall, actual books on them, not decorative spines. A whiteboard with things written on it that she hadn't erased. She was already at the round table when he walked in, laptop open, and she looked up with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Contained attention, the surface stillness of someone whose mind was already moving fast. Close the door, she said. He did. He sat across from her and opened his own laptop and turned it so she could see the screen, and then he walked her through it, all of it. The classification schema comparison, the 61 documented divergence instances, the cross-referenced failure cascade, the way each element connected to the next in a chain that was unmistakable once you could see the whole shape of it. He talked for 11 minutes. She interrupted twice, both times with precise questions that showed she'd followed every step. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen. A classification drift, she said. Systematic and progressive. It started in month 4 of the project and has been compounding since. The downstream systems are receiving data in categories they're not configured to process, which is generating the performance failures in a pattern that looks like hardware stress, but is actually a routing problem. How long to fix it? If I have direct access to the classification engine and someone who knows the original specification well enough to validate the corrections as I make them, a few hours, maybe less. The fix itself is not complex. Finding it was the hard part. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Lawrence has been telling the board it's an API integration failure, she said. He presented a full remediation plan to the executive committee 2 days ago. 40 hours of additional engineering work and a system patch that he projected would cost... She stopped. It would cost a significant amount and require a 10-day timeline. Grant said nothing. If you're right, she said. 10 days from now, the contract deadline will have passed. I know. And if you're right, Lawrence's entire analysis for the past 3 weeks has been wrong. The API layer is showing stress symptoms, Grant said carefully. He wasn't wrong that something was happening there. He was wrong about what was causing it. The API is showing symptoms because the misclassified data is overloading routing functions it was never designed to handle. Fix the classification and the API stress resolves on its own. Elena closed her eyes briefly. Not distress, more like a person processing a chessboard rearranging itself. I need to call a team meeting, she said. I know. Lawrence will push back. Probably. She looked at him. Are you absolutely certain? He held her gaze. Certain enough to stake my credibility on it. Yes. She nodded once, with the finality of a decision already made. Give me 20 minutes. Boom. The team meeting was called for 10:30. Grant was back at his workstation when the notification went out, and he watched the operations center shift in response to it. Engineers checking their phones, a few exchanging looks, the subtle recalibration of a room that knows something is changing but doesn't know what. Juan materialized beside him 4 minutes later. Full team meeting called by Elena. That's not normal. He looked at Grant. Did you tell her? This morning, Juan let out a breath. Okay. He pulled up a chair. Okay, what do you need from me in there? The original specification documents, the ones from project initiation with the classification schema as it was designed. I have them. And I need you to be willing to validate the comparison if it gets contested. You've seen the raw logs, you know what the drift looks like. Juan looked at him steadily. Are you expecting it to get contested? I think there's a reasonable chance. A pause. Pruitt. I'm not assuming anything about Pruitt. I'm just saying the finding is going to challenge a narrative that people have invested in. And when that happens, the instinct is usually to challenge the finding. Juan was quiet for a moment. I'll have the spec documents ready. Thank you. Juan started to stand, then stopped. For what it's worth, he said, quietly enough that it was clearly meant only for Grant, I think you're right. I've thought it was classification related for a week. I just didn't have the comparative documentation to prove it. I know, Grant said. You told me so when we first started talking. That's part of why I trusted my own read. Juan nodded once and went back to his workstation. The conference room they used for team meetings was larger than Elena's office, but still not big enough for the energy that came into it with 11 people. Engineers arranged themselves with the habitual geometry of a group that had been meeting in the same room under pressure for 3 weeks. Rhea near the head of the table, the senior engineers flanking her, Juan toward the middle, the 2 junior engineers at the far end who said the least and absorbed the most. Pruitt arrived 2 minutes before the meeting started, accompanied by Devin Marsh, who was not part of the engineering team and whose presence in the room therefore meant something specific about the nature of what was about to happen. Pruitt sat at the table with the settled authority of a man in his own house and looked at Grant the way he had at the original interview. Not quite at him, more past him, with the peripheral acknowledgement you give to furniture. Elena came in last and positioned herself at the head of the table, and the room arranged itself around her. Thank you for coming in on short notice, she said. Grant has something to share. I'd ask that everyone let him finish before responding. She looked at Grant. Go ahead. He'd set up the shared display before the meeting. His comparative analysis was already on the screen. He stood. He had given presentations exactly twice in his professional life, once to a shift supervisor about a logistics routing issue at the warehouse, once to his son about why eating dinner before dessert was non-negotiable. Neither had been particularly high stakes. This was different, and he knew it, and his body knew it, and he made the decision to acknowledge this to himself rather than pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise was a form of attention splitting that would make him less effective. He was nervous. He was also correct. He let both things be true simultaneously. The Arden system failure has a single source, he said. It's in the data classification schema. He walked them through it. He had tightened the presentation since the version he'd shown Elena. More specific, more visual, the evidence sequenced so that each element built on the previous one in a logic that was hard to dispute at any individual step. He showed the original specification. He showed the current applied schema. He showed the divergence, category by category, instance by instance, with the documentation cross-referenced to actual failure events in the system log. He talked for 14 minutes. When he stopped, the room was quiet for about 3 seconds, which is a long time in a room full of engineers who have opinions. Then Pruitt said, "This is a very compelling presentation of a theory." Grant looked at him. "It's not a theory, it's documented evidence. It's documented correlation." Well, Pruitt's voice was even, not aggressive, more like a professor correcting a student who has made a common error. "You've shown that the classification schema has drifted from specification. You've shown that this drift correlates temporally with the performance issues. Correlation is not causation." "The correlation is mechanistic," Grant said. "This isn't a statistical pattern. It's a direct functional relationship. The downstream systems are configured to process data in specific categories. They're receiving data in different categories. The failure is not correlation to the classification drift. It is the classification drift." That's an assumption. It's a logical inference from the system architecture. Based on, Pruitt picked up his tablet, made a show of consulting something on it. "Your review of the system logs, which you've been doing for how long? 10 days? 11. My team has been in this system for 3 weeks." "I know," Grant said. "And they've done excellent work on the API layer analysis. The API layer is under stress. That's a real finding. I'm saying the stress is a symptom rather than the source, and here's why." He moved to the next screen. "This is the API error log. These are the timestamps of the API failures." He moved to the next screen. "This is the classification error log. Every API failure is preceded by a classification error by an average of 47 seconds. Effect follows cause. The classification errors are generating conditions that the API layer can't handle, which is why the API failures look primary. They're secondary." Silence. Rhea Nair was leaning forward now, looking at the 2 logs side by side on the screen. "Can you run the timestamp correlation across the full 30-day log?" she said. "It's in the appendix, page 4. She found it. She looked at it for a long moment. Pruitt said, "Even if we accept the correlation as mechanistic, and I'm not accepting that, modifying the classification schema in a live system is extremely high risk. You're talking about changing foundational architecture while the system is actively processing the Arden contract data." "I'm talking about restoring the classification schema to its original specification," Grant said. "The original specification was tested and validated. We're not introducing something new. We're correcting a drift back to a known working state. Things change in 4 months. We don't know what other adaptations the system may have made. That's why I'm proposing we do it in a staged sequence," Grant said. "Correct the highest drift categories first. Monitor the downstream response for 2 hours before proceeding to the next stage. If anything unexpected occurs, we halt and reassess. The risk is manageable and significantly lower than the alternative, which is continuing on the API remediation path and missing the contract deadline." Another silence. Devin Marsh, who had been quiet throughout, looked at Pruitt with an expression that Grant couldn't entirely read. Not supportive, not dismissive. Waiting. Pruitt set his tablet down. When he spoke again, something in his tone had shifted, not in the direction of concession, but away from the measured professorial register and towards something that had more edge in it. "I'd like to understand something," he said. "You're a temporary consultant brought in outside the normal project structure. You've been here 11 days. You're now proposing a significant modification to a live critical system based on an analysis that my team of senior engineers has not validated." "I validated it," Quan said. Everyone looked at him. Quan was looking at his laptop screen, not Pruitt. "I looked at the raw logs with Grant 4 days ago. The classification drift is real. I should have said something then, but..." He stopped, continued. "I'm saying it now. He's right." The room held the weight of this for a moment. Pruitt looked at Quan with an expression that had moved past professional detachment into something cooler. "James," he said, in the tone reserved for employees who have said something that will be remembered. "Lawrence," Elena said. Not loud. Quiet, actually, but with a quality that stopped the room completely. "Let him finish." She was looking at Pruitt with an expression Grant had not seen on her face before. Not angry, not defensive. Something more still than either of those things, and more final. Pruitt looked at her. "Grant," Elena said, "if we proceed with your correction sequence, what do you need?" He named it, direct access to the classification engine, Quan with the original specification documents to validate each correction in real time, and a rollback protocol in place before they started so that if anything unexpected happened, they could restore the previous state immediately. How long from start to completion? If nothing unexpected, 2 to 3 hours. She looked around the table. Ria. Ria looked at her analysis on the screen for another moment, then she said, "The timestamp correlation is hard to argue with. I want to see it play out across the full log." She looked at Grant. "Give me 30 minutes to run my own verification on the appendix data." "Take whatever you need," Ria nodded. "If it holds, I think we should try it." Elena said, "Lawrence." Pruitt looked at her. There was something happening in his face. The specific interior negotiation of a person who has built a position and is now calculating the cost of defending it versus the cost of releasing it, and who does not love either option. "I have significant reservations," he said. "I understand," Elena said. "Your reservations are noted." She looked at Grant. 30 minutes. Then we proceed. Ria's verification took 22 minutes. She found 2 instances in the appendix data that she questioned and brought to Grant directly, standing at his workstation with her laptop, and they worked through both together, and at the end of it she said, "Okay," in the flat tone of someone whose skepticism has been satisfied, which was the only kind of satisfaction that mattered. They moved to the operations center at 11:53. The team arranged itself around the main workstation cluster, with the specific organization of people preparing for something that could go well or badly, and who are holding both possibilities in mind at the same time. Quan had the specification documents open on his screen. Ria had the rollback protocol set up and ready. 2 other engineers had monitoring dashboards pulled up on secondary screens to watch the system response in real time. Pruitt was in the room, standing near the back wall, and Marsh was beside him. Neither of them was at a workstation. Elena positioned herself where she could see both the main screen and the monitoring dashboards. She didn't say anything to Grant before he started. She just looked at him once, and the look said what it said, and he nodded slightly and turned to the keyboard. The first classification correction took 6 minutes. The highest drift category, the one responsible for the largest volume of misrouted data, restored to its original specification parameter, the correction logged, and confirmed. Everyone watched the monitoring dashboards. 47 seconds. The error rate in the primary processing stream dropped by 31%. "That's real," said one of the engineers at the monitoring station, and his voice had the involuntary quality of someone saying something out loud without deciding to. Grant moved to the second category. This was where it got harder, not technically, but physically. The specific kind of pressure that builds when a room full of people are watching you do something that matters, and the stakes are visible to everyone, and you're aware of your own hands on the keyboard in a way you normally aren't. His breathing was deliberate. He caught himself checking the rollback protocol indicator on the secondary screen more than he needed to, just to confirm it was there, just to confirm that the floor was solid. The second correction took 9 minutes because the drift was more complex, and he stopped twice to check Quan's specification documents before committing. Quan was steady beside him. No rushing, no nervous commentary, just the clean, efficient communication of a person who understood exactly what they were doing and why. The second correction went in. The monitoring dashboards responded within a minute. Error rate dropped another 18%. "It's working," Ria said from across the room, to no one in particular. It was working, but it wasn't done. The fourth correction was when things got complicated. Not catastrophically. Nothing crashed, no alarms. But the response on the monitoring dashboard was not what Grant expected. The error rate didn't drop. It held flat for 30 seconds, then ticked upward by 3%. He stopped. "Hold," he said. The room noticed immediately. Someone at a monitoring station said, "Error rate is up," in a voice carefully stripped of alarm. "I see it," Grant said. He looked at the correction he'd just made. Then he looked at the raw data flowing through the affected stream. He pulled up the specification document and looked at the category parameter again, and something was wrong. Not with his correction, but with the specification itself. The document Quan had showed him a version of the original parameter that had itself been modified sometime in month 3, before the major drift began, as part of a system update that had apparently not been flagged as a specification change. The floor was not exactly where he'd thought it was. Grant, Elena's voice, even. I need a minute. Pruitt from the back wall. The error rate is climbing. I see it, Grant said again, and his voice came out flat and controlled, and he was not entirely sure how. He looked at the original update log. He needed the month 3 update documentation. He looked at Quan. The system update for month 3, he said. Do you have that documentation? Give me 30 seconds. 20 seconds. Quan pulled it up. Grant looked at it, found the relevant parameter, cross-referenced it against the current state. The classification parameter he'd applied was correct relative to the original specification, but the month 3 update had modified the downstream processing expectation in a way that meant the downstream system was now configured for something slightly different than the original spec. He needed to apply the original correction plus the month 3 delta. He could do that. He needed 45 seconds to calculate it correctly. Stand by, he said. He calculated it. Pruitt said something to Marsh that Grant did not hear clearly and did not have the bandwidth to process. Grant applied the corrected parameter. Watched the screen. 12 seconds. The error rate dropped. Past the flat line where it had been before the complication, past where it had been after the 3rd correction, down to a level lower than anything the monitoring dashboard had shown in 3 weeks. The room exhaled. Not all at once. It wasn't a dramatic collective breath. It was more like a slow release, person by person, the sound of people who had been bracing for something and were allowing themselves to stop. Keep going, Rhea said. He kept going. The 6th and 7th corrections went cleanly. The 8th took 4 minutes. After the 9th, the primary performance metrics for the Arden system crossed above the contracted benchmark threshold for the first time since the failure had begun. We're above benchmark, said the engineer at the monitoring station. Grant didn't stop. He had 3 more categories to correct, and he was going to finish what he started. The 10th? The 11th. At the 12th and final correction, the Arden system's performance metrics stabilized across all monitored functions at 94% of optimal, above benchmark, above contract threshold, above anything the engineering team had managed to achieve in 3 weeks of round-the-clock work. He sat back. His shoulders ached. He hadn't noticed until now. The room was quiet in the particular way of people who have just watched something happen and are still in the process of understanding what they watched. Rhea was looking at the monitoring dashboard with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite wonder, but something in between. Quan was typing. Running verification queries, Grant knew, because that's what you did when you needed to confirm that what you were seeing was what you thought you were seeing. Elena was looking at Grant. He looked back at her. She didn't say anything. There was no sweep of dramatic declaration, no moment of triumphant announcement. She just looked at him, and her expression was the most open he'd seen it. Not the composed attention of their meetings or the contained tiredness of the elevator, but something that had fewer layers in it, something more direct. Then she looked at the room. I want a full system stability check across all Arden functions, she said. Rhea, coordinate with James on the verification sequence. I want a written status report to the client by 3 o'clock. Yes, Rhea said. I also want a full post-mortem documentation of the classification drift, how it started, when it started, what conditions allowed it to compound for 4 months without detection. She paused. That's not about blame. It's about making sure we understand how it happened so it doesn't happen again. The room began to move with the purposeful energy of people who have a clear task and the specific relief of that clarity. Pruitt had not moved from the back wall. Marsh was beside him. Grant looked at them without meaning to, just a passing glance as he stood from the workstation, and caught the expression on Pruitt's face in an unguarded moment. It was not the expression of a man engaged with the situation in front of him. It was the expression of a man doing rapid internal calculations about a different situation entirely, one that had nothing to do with the Arden system and everything to do with the room's altered geometry. Grant looked away. He went back to his workstation afterward and sat there for a few minutes without doing anything in particular. His hands were steady, which he noted. The shakiness he'd expected during the 4th correction complication had not materialized in the moment and was apparently not going to materialize after it either. He thought about Owen. He thought about the way Owen had slipped his hand into his on the walk home from Marcus's apartment, without announcement, just a hand appearing in his hand. He thought about the folder of work samples he'd carried into the original interview and never had a chance to show anyone. He thought about Pruitt's laugh in that conference room, the compressed exhale through the nose, the half second too long, and about the specific kind of humiliation that doesn't raise its voice. He thought about all of this not with bitterness, which surprised him a little, but with something more like clarity. The recognition that things had a shape you sometimes couldn't see until you got to a high enough vantage point, and that the shape was not always cruel and was sometimes stranger and more interesting than you expected. Quan appeared and set a cup of coffee on the desk beside him, fresh, not the hours-old kind. Just placed it there without comment and walked away. Grant looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up. He was still sitting there, coffee in hand, when Rhea came to find him 20 minutes later. "Verification is clean," she said. "All 12 corrections are holding. System performance is stable." Good. She stood there for a moment, which wasn't her style. She was a move-on to the next thing person, efficiently forward-moving. The fact that she'd paused meant something. "I should have looked at the raw logs myself," she said. Not an apology, more like a statement of fact she felt obligated to make. "I was following the team's existing hypothesis track instead of going back to first principles. That's on me." "You had 8 engineers and 3 weeks of institutional momentum," Grant said. "It's hard to go back to first principles when the team has already built a structure." "That's a generous read." "It's an accurate one." She looked at him for a moment with the particular assessment of someone recalibrating an earlier position. "Elena wants you in her office at 4, she said. "Don't be late." She walked away. Grant looked at the clock on his workstation. It was 2:17. He had just enough time to handle pickup, get Owen settled at Marcus's place for the afternoon. Marcus had already offered, had said just in case something runs long, "I've got him." And make it back for 4 o'clock. He packed up his laptop. He put on his jacket. He walked through the operations center, which had settled into a high-functioning hum that was entirely different from the exhausted grinding tension of the past 2 weeks, and he nodded to Quan on his way past, and Quan gave him a small nod back that contained more acknowledgement than the gesture suggested. He took the elevator down. He walked out of the building into the afternoon light, and the city was doing its ordinary afternoon things. Traffic thickening toward the evening rush, the smell of someone's food cart 2 blocks down. A pair of pigeons with extremely strong opinions about a corner of sidewalk, and he stood on the pavement outside the glass tower for a moment. He had saved a $20 million contract. He had done it in 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had done it after 11 days of being treated as peripheral by most of the people in the building. He started walking toward the subway. He had a pickup to make. Owen was sitting on the front steps of Marcus's building with Gerald in a juice box when Grant came around the corner at 3:22, 7 minutes late, which almost never happened. "You're late," Owen said without accusation, more like a person confirming a data point. "I know, 7 minutes." 6.5. Owen stood up and tucked Gerald under his arm. "Marcus said you were probably saving the world." Marcus exaggerates. "Did you fix it?" Grant took the empty juice box from him and folded it in half the way Owen liked. "Yeah, we fixed it." Owen processed this while they walked. He had a way of receiving news, good or complicated, that involved a period of quiet during which his face did very little, followed by a question that revealed he'd been thinking about something adjacent to the obvious thing. "Were the people nice about it?" he asked. Grant looked at him. "What do you mean? Like, were they nice when you fixed it, or were they the same as before?" Grant thought about Rhea's straight-faced acknowledgement at his workstation, about Quan setting a cup of coffee down without ceremony, about Pruitt standing against the back wall doing calculations behind his eyes. "Some of them," he said. Owen nodded, unsurprised. "That's probably normal." "Probably." They walked another half block. Owen was kicking a bottle cap along the pavement with practiced consistency, keeping it moving without breaking stride, which was a skill he'd been developing for 2 weeks and which Grant had been pretending not to notice in order to preserve the boy's sense of independent accomplishment. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Are you going back tonight?" "I have a meeting at 4. Marcus said he'd keep you until—" "I know. He already told me." A pause. "Is it a good meeting or a complicated meeting?" Grant looked at his son. 7 years old, and already he'd developed a taxonomy of meetings based entirely on the quality of his father's silences in the hours surrounding them. "I'm not sure yet," Grant said honestly. Owen kicked the bottle cap a final time, sending it into the gutter with a satisfying skitter. "Okay," he said, and slipped his hand into Grant's for the last block to Marcus's door, and that was that. The fourth floor of the Heartline building had a different atmosphere at 3:58 in the afternoon than it had at any point in the previous 11 days. The tight, grinding pressure that had lived in the air of the operations center like a low-frequency hum was gone, replaced by something that wasn't exactly celebration. The work of verification and documentation and client communication was ongoing and demanding, but that had a different quality to it. People moved with purpose rather than desperation. The monitoring dashboard showed green across all Arden functions. Someone had written 94% and holding on the whiteboard in the break room, and underneath it, in different handwriting, someone had added finally. Grant passed through without stopping and took the elevator to 29. Elena's assistant, Diane, 50s, precise, the kind of efficiency that had been refined over many years into something almost invisible, looked up when he came through the door. "She's expecting you," Diane said. "Go ahead." He knocked anyway. "Come in." Elena was at her desk this time rather than the round table, and she was finishing a phone call, holding up one finger to indicate 2 minutes. He sat in one of the chairs across from the desk and looked at the bookshelves while he waited. Actual titles, he noticed. A mix of technical texts and history, and a few novels, the kind of collection that said something real about the person, rather than a decorator's idea of what a CEO should be reading. She hung up and looked at him, and the quality of the silence had something different in it than any silence they'd shared before. Less transactional, more like two people who have been through something and are now sitting in what comes after. "The client called an hour ago," she said. "They've confirmed the performance metrics are restored. The contract is intact." "Good." "The board has been notified. I'll be doing a full briefing tomorrow." She paused. "I wanted to talk to you before any of that." "Okay." She folded her hands on the desk. It was a gesture he recognized from the interview, from their first roundtable meeting, and he'd come to understand it as her thinking posture, the physical arrangement she settled into when she was about to say something she'd been organizing for a while. "I want to know about you, she said. "Not your analysis of the Arden system. I want to know how you got here." He looked at her. "I've read your application 3 times, she said. "I know the facts on paper. I want to know the actual version." It was an unusual request, not inappropriate, just unexpected in the way that honest questions are sometimes unexpected from people whose professional lives are conducted mostly in the register of strategic communication. He thought about deflecting. He was practiced at deflection, at managing the version of himself he presented to professional contexts, keeping the warehouse and the midnight studying and the single-father infrastructure of his life in a separate compartment from the work he was trying to be taken seriously for. He'd learned early that the full story often made people uncomfortable in ways that were counterproductive, that they either pitied it or found it convenient to use against him, and neither response was useful. But Elena Hart had called him back 9 days after an interview where her own director had laughed at him. She had given him direct CEO access and bypassed her own hierarchy. She had sat in the operations center that morning and watched him work through a complication in real time without flinching, and when the dashboard showed green, she had not made it a performance. She had just looked at him with something that had fewer layers in it. He decided to answer the actual question. "I dropped out of college after 2 years," he said. "The money stopped working. I told myself I'd go back and I didn't go back. I moved through a series of jobs that paid enough to keep things stable. Line cook, delivery driver, moving company." He paused. "Owen's mother left when he was 18 months old. After that, it was just the 2 of us." Elena didn't move. She was listening the way she always listened, completely, without organizing her response while he was talking. "I got the warehouse job because it paid better than anything else I could find, and it had a reliable schedule, and Owen needed reliability more than anything else." He looked at the desk. "I started teaching myself data analytics about 3 years ago, nights, after he was asleep. Online courses, free university content, working through problems on my own." He looked up. "I'd always been good at seeing patterns. I didn't know that was a thing, a specific professional skill, until I started reading about it. I just thought it was the way I thought." "It is a specific professional skill," Elena said. "A significant one. I know that now. What made you apply for the position here?" "I'd been applying for data roles for about a year and getting nowhere. The Heartline posting showed up and the salary was, He stopped. It was a number that would change what I could give Owen. Not dramatically, but enough. Better school options. Not having to do the math every month about whether the car repair goes on the card or gets deferred another few weeks. He paused. I knew I probably wasn't what you were looking for. I applied anyway because not applying meant the answer was definitely no. The room was quiet for a moment. When Lawrence laughed, Elena said, you said you didn't think it was funny. I didn't. What did you think? He considered the question. I thought it was easy. Laughing at something because it doesn't fit the category you've already decided it belongs in. It's the least interesting response to anything. He looked at her. I also thought it was a waste of everyone's time, including his. Something moved across Elena's expression. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. I should have said something in that room, she said. You said something when you called me. She was quiet for a moment. I've been in rooms where people decided what I was worth before I spoke. You get good at reading the specific quality of that, the way attention shifts away from you before you've finished a sentence. She looked at him steadily. I watched it happen to you, and I recognized it, and I said nothing, and that's not something I'm proud of. Grant held this. He didn't dismiss it. That would have been its own form of dishonesty. But he didn't want to make her carry more of it than was useful. You called 9 days later, he said. I think that counts. She looked at him. It counts for something. I'm not sure it counts for enough. He didn't argue. She was entitled to her own accounting. What happened next took him by surprise, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. She opened a folder on her desk, actual paper, he noticed, in a building full of screens, and slid it across to him. I'd like to offer you a permanent position, she said. He looked at the folder. Didn't open it yet. Senior Data Specialist, she said, the role you applied for, with some modifications to the scope based on what I've seen in the past 11 days. He looked at her. What modifications? The original posting was for a specialist who would work within the existing system's architecture team. What I'm now thinking is something with broader scope, cross-functional access, direct reporting to me rather than through the operations hierarchy, involvement in system design decisions rather than just maintenance and diagnostics. He processed this. That's a different role. Yes. Why? She looked at him with the directness that was, he'd come to understand, her most consistent quality. Because what you did this morning wasn't specialist work. You came into a system that 8 experienced engineers had been working on for 3 weeks. You identified a failure mode they missed, you built the case for it from scratch, and you corrected it in under 3 hours. That's not a specialist skill set. That's a diagnostic and architectural skill set, and I'd be wasting it if I put you in a role that's primarily about maintenance. He looked at the folder again. He opened it. The salary figure was on the second page. He looked at it for a moment without expression, which took some effort. It was more than he'd imagined asking for, more than the original posting had listed. It was the kind of number that meant Owen's school options opened up, that the car repair stopped being a monthly calculation, that the second-hand laptop got replaced with something that didn't freeze when he ran large data sets, that the $400 emergency fund that had been his entire financial buffer for 3 years became something that could actually grow. It was the kind of number that meant he could stop doing the math. He set the folder down. I have conditions, he said. Elena nodded once. Tell me. Pickup is at 3:15 every day. That is not a flexible boundary. Already accommodated in the role structure. The position is results-based, not hours-based. You manage your own schedule as long as the work gets done. If Owen is sick, I'm not available. A fever, a school call, a bad day, whatever it is. He comes first. Understood. I want it in the employment agreement, not as a verbal understanding. She held his gaze. I'll have legal draft specific language. You review it before you sign anything. He nodded. He looked at the folder again, then back at her. Why direct report to you? He said. That's going to create friction with your operations leadership. Elena was quiet for a moment. Lawrence Pruitt submitted a request this afternoon to review the post-mortem documentation before it goes to the board. Grant said nothing. He wants the opportunity to provide context around the API layer analysis before the board sees the full timeline. She said this without particular inflection, neither editorializing nor defending. What did you tell him? I told him the post-mortem would go to the board as documented. That context was welcome in the accompanying materials, but would not alter the factual record. A pause. He's a capable operations director. He's been at this company for 6 years. But he made a decision 3 weeks ago that cost this company significant time and risk exposure. And he made a secondary decision this morning to position himself against a correct finding rather than evaluate it on the merits. She looked at Grant. I'm not interested in rewarding that pattern with structural access to someone whose primary value is their independence of analysis. Grant thought about Kwan's warning in the operations center the week before. There are people in this company who would like to see her fail on this. He thought about Pruitt against the back wall, doing his calculations. He's going to make this difficult, Grant said. Probably. For both of us. Yes. She said it simply, without drama. Is that a problem for you? He thought about it honestly. He thought about the last 3 years of doing everything the hard way. Every door opened by force of will rather than by any particular door-opening apparatus working in his favor. He thought about being laughed out of this building 6 weeks ago, and about sitting in the kitchen at midnight anyway, building something that turned out to be real. No, he said. I've been dealing with difficult for a while. The corner of her mouth moved. I know. That's one of the reasons I'm asking. He didn't say yes that afternoon. He told her he needed 24 hours, which was true, and she told him she respected that, which he believed. He took the folder with him and rode the elevator down and walked out into the early evening, the city shifting into its after-work mode, the light lower and more horizontal, the streets thickening with the particular density of people who are done with one part of their day and in transit to the next. He picked up Owen from Marcus's apartment. Marcus answered the door in a flour-dusted apron, which meant he'd been cooking. Marcus cooked when he was thinking about something, a habit so consistent that Grant had learned to read Marcus's emotional state by the complexity of whatever he was making. You're making something with pastry, Grant said. Lamb stew and biscuits. Marcus looked at him. You look different. I'm the same. You look like something happened. Something happened. Marcus glanced back into the apartment where Owen was visible at the kitchen table, working on something. Good something or complicated something? Both. Marcus looked at him for a long moment with the particular attention of a person who has known you through multiple versions of yourself and can read the specific weight you're carrying. Come for dinner, he said. Both of you. Grant almost said no. He had the folder in his bag and he wanted to sit with it. But Owen had looked up from the table and was already watching him with the focused patience of a kid who had learned when to wait and when to ask, and Marcus was already stepping back to let them in, and the smell of the stew was real and warm, and Grant had eaten a sandwich at his workstation 6 hours ago. Okay, he said. Over dinner, Owen eating with the focused efficiency of a hungry child, Marcus asking questions he phrased carefully to avoid seeming like he was asking what he was actually asking. Grant gave a version of the day that was true without being exhaustive. He talked about the system correction. He talked about the meeting with Elena. He didn't pull out the folder. Owen listened in the particular way he listened to things he was filing away for later rather than processing in real time. After dinner, while Marcus was clearing plates and Owen was in the other room with Gerald, and some piece of elaborate project Grant couldn't identify from the doorway, Marcus leaned against the counter and said quietly enough that Owen wouldn't hear, What's in the folder? Grant looked at him. Job offer. Marcus set down the plate he was holding. The place with the interview. Yeah. The place where they laughed at you. Yeah. A pause. Good offer? Very good offer. Marcus picked the plate back up. Then why are you waiting? Grant looked at the doorway to the other room. At Owen, bent over whatever he was making, Gerald tucked beside him. Because I want to be sure it's right, he said. Not just that the money is good, that it's actually right. Marcus was quiet for a moment. And is it? Grant thought about Elena Hart at the head of a table, watching. About a phone call 9 days after a door closed. About a round room where someone had listened to his actual story instead of scanning his resume. About the operations center that afternoon, and a monitoring dashboard going green and the specific quality of silence that meant a room full of skeptical people had run out of counter-arguments. I think so, he said. Then go home and call her tomorrow, Marcus said, with the no-nonsense practicality of a man who has watched his best friend operate on insufficient sleep and excessive self-questioning for 3 years. And eat the biscuit I saved you. You didn't finish it. As he looked at the folder that night after Owen was in bed. He read every page of it. The role description, the compensation structure, the benefits, the contractual language around schedule flexibility. He made notes in the margin, things he wanted to confirm, language he wanted tightened. One clause in the intellectual property section that he thought needed clarification about work done on personal time. He sat with it for a long time. He thought about the version of himself that had walked into Heartline 6 weeks ago carrying a folder of work samples nobody asked to see, with a warehouse-pressed blazer and a son waiting at home who thought his father could do anything. He thought about Pruitt's laugh, about the elevator down, and the breath held until the doors closed, and the hands that didn't shake. He thought about 3 years of midnight studying at this same kitchen table, the same 4 walls, the same radiator with its furniture dragging 3 a.m. Sound, the same eastward-facing windows that got good light in the mornings. 3 years of building something in the dark on nothing but the conviction that it was real, that the pattern recognition that lived in his head was worth something, that the fact that he'd arrived at it without a classroom or a credential didn't make it less true. He thought about Owen's question, how will you know when you're all the way figured out? He looked at the folder. He thought he might be close. Artsuk. The next morning he called Elena at 8:43. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been expecting the call. I have some questions about the IP clause in Section 4, he said, without preamble. A beat. Then, with something that was definitely closer to a smile than anything she'd shown in their previous conversations, Diane has a red line draft ready. She was expecting you'd find that clause. Smart. I hire smart people, she said, when I'm allowed to. He looked at the folder open on the kitchen table. Owen had left for school 40 minutes ago. Marcus's daughter walked them both in the mornings, another piece of the infrastructure that kept things running, and the apartment was quiet in the particular way of a place that has a person-shaped absence in it. I have one more condition, he said. Tell me. The post-mortem documentation. The classification drift analysis, the timeline, the full record of how the correction was found and implemented. He paused. I want it attributed accurately. A silence. As in, Elena said, not adjusted for anyone's benefit. As in documented the way it happened, with the names of the people who did what. Another silence, longer. That's already my intention, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, I wanted to say it directly anyway. I understand. A pause. Is there anything else? He looked at the folder, at the margin notes, at the second page with the salary figure. No, he said. I'll sign it. The paperwork took 3 days to finalize, which Elena had predicted and which Grant used to work out his notice at the warehouse. His floor supervisor, a solid man named Ray, who had covered for him on more than one occasion, and who had known, in the uncomplicated way of practical people, that Grant was on his way somewhere even if the direction wasn't clear yet, shook his hand on his last shift and said, "About time," and went back to his clipboard. On his last day, he stood for a moment in the loading dock where he'd taken the call from Elena's assistant 4 weeks ago. The dock looked exactly the same as it always had. Pallets and forklifts and the PA system and the specific quality of cold air that came off the concrete floor in the mornings. He thought about all the nights he'd driven home from this building and sat down at the laptop and opened a data analysis course at 11:30 p.m. and worked until the words started blurring. He thought about how much of what he'd built had been built here. Not in a classroom, not with any institutional support, but in the margins of this place and in the midnight kitchen of his apartment, in the only hours that belonged entirely to him. He picked up his bag. He walked out. His first official day as senior data architect at Heartline Technologies, the title had been upgraded from specialist during the negotiation, a change Elena had proposed and Grant had not argued with, was on a Tuesday in early November. He wore the same gray blazer from Marcus's wedding, freshly pressed. Owen had inspected it at breakfast with the gravity of a military aide checking dress uniform before a ceremony, declared it acceptable, and gone back to his cereal. You nervous? Owen had asked. A little. Roller coaster or dentist? Grant had thought about it honestly. Roller coaster, he said. Owen had nodded, satisfied. That's the good kind. He rode the elevator to the 28th floor and badged in for the first time with his own permanent credentials, his name on the badge, his photo, the Heartline logo, and the operations center looked the same as it had for the past 11 days and entirely different in the way that a place changes when you stop being a visitor in it. Quan was at his workstation and looked up and gave him the same small nod as always, which was its own form of welcome. Ria was in a meeting. She'd emailed him at 7:15 with 3 questions about the post-mortem documentation and a note at the bottom that said, "Glad you're staying in the tone of someone who has weighed whether to say it and decided the weight came out on the side of saying it." Grant sat down at the workstation that was now his workstation, opened his laptop, and looked at the monitoring dashboard. Arden was at 96%. He started work. He had 3 data sets flagged for review, a meeting with Elena at 2, and a pickup at 3:15 that was not negotiable. It was, in every way that mattered, an ordinary day, and that, the simple, grounded, hard-won ordinariness of it, was the thing he had been working toward for 3 years without knowing exactly what it would look like when he got there. He opened the first data set. He began. The first 3 months were not a clean upward line. Grant had known they wouldn't be in the abstract way you know things before you've lived them, before the knowing becomes specific and textured and inconvenient. He'd understood intellectually that walking into an established organization with direct CEO, access and a title that had been created specifically for him would generate friction. He'd prepared for it the way he prepared for most things, by thinking it through carefully at the kitchen table after Owen was asleep, mapping the likely failure modes, deciding in advance how he'd respond to each one. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the particular quality of institutional resistance, the way it operated not through confrontation but through omission. Meetings where his calendar invite arrived 30 minutes before the start time. Datasets flagged for his review that turned out to be already resolved by the time he saw them. A project scoping discussion that happened in a hallway conversation between 3 senior engineers and then materialized as a completed decision in his inbox the following morning. None of it was provable. None of it was the kind of thing you could bring to anyone with documentation and say, "This is happening." It was just the steady, low-grade experience of being made to feel that your presence in a space was conditional, that your access was something being extended rather than earned, that the ground you were standing on had been lent to you rather than built by you. He didn't tell Elena about most of it, not because he was protecting anyone, but because he'd lived long enough in conditions of structural disadvantage to know the difference between friction that needed to be addressed and friction that needed to be outlasted. He filed the former category. He absorbed the latter and kept working. Quan saw it. They'd fallen into a working rhythm over the weeks. Not a formal partnership, more like the natural alignment of 2 people who had the same instincts about how to approach a problem and whose paths through the organization kept crossing. Quan was careful and precise about what he said and didn't say, which Grant respected. Pruitt had a conversation with the systems team Monday morning, Quan said one afternoon in December, without looking up from his screen, before the 9 o'clock stand-up. I figured. He's framing the Arden post-mortem as a documentation anomaly, positioning your finding as something that emerged from the team's collective work rather than... "I know," Grant said. Quan looked at him. "You're not going to do anything about it?" The board received the documented record. Elena signed off on the attribution. What Pruitt tells his team in hallway conversations doesn't change the record. It changes the story people tell. People tell whatever story they want, Grant said. That's always been true. It's not a solvable problem. Quan was quiet for a moment. "You're less bothered by this than I would be." Grant thought about it honestly. "I'm bothered by it," he said. "I'm just not surprised by it. There's a difference." He went back to his dataset. Quan went back to his. What Grant didn't say, didn't have the words for yet, though the shape of it was forming, was that he had spent 32 years being underestimated by systems that were not designed with him in mind, and the underestimation had never stopped him. And there was something almost clarifying about watching it continue in a new context with better furniture. The mechanism was the same. The response was the same. He put his head down and he worked, and the work was real, and the real work accumulated. Elena knew more than she said, which he suspected and confirmed in a conversation in early December when she asked him, with characteristic directness, how he was finding the internal dynamics. He was honest with her in the same proportion she had been honest with him, which was to say considerably. "There's a coordinated effort to reframe the Arden narrative," he said. "Nothing I can document. Lots of things I can observe." She was quiet for a moment. "Lawrence has been with this company a long time." "I know. Institutional knowledge has real value." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it." "I know you're not. I'm thinking out loud." She looked at the whiteboard on her office wall, still covered in things she hadn't erased, though the specific things had changed since his first visit. "He's also made 3 analytical errors in the past 60 days that his team covered for rather than surfaced. I'm monitoring it." "That's your call." "Yes," she said. "It is." A pause. "I wanted you to know I'm not unaware." He looked at her across the round table. She was tired in the way she was often tired, the managed, functional tiredness of someone who was carrying more than one person's worth of responsibility and had gotten good at not letting it show all the way to the surface. He'd noticed, over the months, the specific pressures she was under that had nothing to do with the Arden contract or the engineering team or Lawrence Pruitt, the board dynamics, the quiet, ongoing negotiation around her leadership, the meetings where her decisions were questioned with a particular persistence that had a specific texture to it, a texture he recognized from other contexts. "Are you okay?" he asked, with the same genuine intention she'd used when she'd asked him the same thing in an elevator 3 months ago. She looked at him, and for a moment her face did something it rarely did. Let the question land rather than managing it. "Some days," she said. "Not every day." He nodded. He didn't try to fix it because it wasn't fixable in this room or this conversation, and she would have seen through the attempt anyway. "Same," he said. She almost smiled. "That's somewhat reassuring." The project that changed things started in January, and it started because Grant couldn't sleep. He'd been looking, in his peripheral hours, the late evenings after Owen went to bed, the early mornings before the alarm, at Heartline's hiring patterns. Not because anyone had asked him to, because it was the kind of thing his mind did when it had data available to it. It looked for patterns, and the pattern it found in Heartline's 12-year hiring record was one he recognized from a very particular angle. Heartline hired from 17 universities. 14 of the 17 were in the top 50 national rankings. The other 3 were state schools, included because they had specific program strengths in areas Heartline needed. In 12 years, the company had hired one person without a 4-year degree into a non-administrative role. That person was Grant Mercer. The pattern wasn't unique to Heartline. He knew that, had read enough about talent acquisition to understand that the credential filter was industry standard, practically universal, so deeply embedded in hiring infrastructure that most companies had stopped examining it the way you stop examining the floor you're walking on. It was just there. It had always been there. The assumption was load-bearing. But Grant had spent 3 years teaching himself at a level that most credentialed engineers had not reached, had found a failure mode that a team of 8 of them had missed. And the only reason he'd gotten through the door at all was because one person had read past his resume to what he'd actually built. He started writing. Not a report. More like a working document. A scratch pad. The kind of thing he made when he was thinking about something he hadn't yet decided to say out loud. He pulled the hiring data. He mapped the correlation between credential requirements and actual role performance. Heartline had 18 months of performance review data for each employee, which was enough to work with. He built a preliminary analysis. What he found was not what he expected, which was how he knew it was real. Credential level did not correlate with performance rating in 37% of roles across the company. In the data and systems architecture function specifically, Grant's domain, the correlation was even weaker. The highest performing people in those roles had advanced degrees at exactly the rate you'd expect if the degrees were irrelevant, which statistically suggested they were. He sat with this for 2 weeks. He built the analysis out properly, checked it from 6 different angles, found the alternative explanations, and stress-tested each one. Then he sent Elena a calendar invite that said simply, "Have something to show you. 30 minutes. Patek." She looked at his analysis for a long time without speaking. He had learned over the months to be comfortable with her silences, to read them not as absence but as processing, the particular quality of attention she gave to things she was taking seriously. This silence had more weight in it than most. "You built this on your own time," she said finally. Yes. Why? He looked at the window. The January light was flat and gray, and the city below had the muted quality of a winter morning. Because I know what it costs, he said. Specifically, not abstractly. I know what it costs to have built something real and not be able to show it to anyone who can do anything with it. The credential filter doesn't just screen out unqualified people, it screens out qualified people who arrived at their qualification differently. He paused. I was one of them. There are more. She looked at the analysis again. The board will push back on this, she said. Hard. I know. They'll call it a liability issue. Credential standards as risk management. The data doesn't support that framing. The data rarely stops people from using a framing they're comfortable with. She looked at him. I'm not saying no. I'm saying you should understand what you're asking me to walk into. He understood. He'd thought about it. I also think, he said carefully, that you're the right person to walk into it. Specifically. She looked at him. You know what it looks like when a room decides what you're worth before you've spoken, he said. So do I. That's not an accident. That's a perspective. And it's more useful than the perspective of someone who has never had to earn their way into a room the hard way. The silence that followed was different from the others. More interior. That's a significant thing to say to your employer, she said. I know, I mean it as a significant thing. She looked at the analysis for another moment. Then she closed the folder and looked at him directly. Give me a month to prepare the board presentation, she said. Work with me on the data structure. We'll build it together. He nodded. And Grant, she said. Yeah. This was good thinking. She said it simply, without ornamentation, not performance of a compliment, just the fact. He said, thank you, and meant that simply too. They worked on it through January and into February. Grant building the analytical backbone, Elena constructing the strategic framing, the two of them meeting twice a week in her office at the round table to argue through the weak points before the board could find them. It was good work. Not clean. There were sessions where they disagreed sharply about framing, where Elena's institutional knowledge about what the board would accept ran into Grant's insistence on not softening findings that were clear, where they had to sit with the friction long enough to find the version that was both honest and viable. He learned things about her in those sessions that he hadn't known from the operational context of the Arden crisis. She second-guessed herself more than she showed in public. Not in a paralyzing way, but in the productive way of someone who takes seriously the possibility of being wrong. She had a sharper sense of humor than the composed public face suggested, dry and precise and deployed without warning. She had been fighting a variation of the same fight for her entire professional life. Not just the wheelchair, but the age, the gender, the specific convergence of factors that made every room she walked into a room that had already formed an opinion. She had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars while that was true. He thought about this sometimes, not with the uncomplicated admiration of a profile piece, but with the more useful recognition of someone who understood the specific texture of the fight from a different but adjacent angle. They had both been defined by categories that were not the most important things about them. They had both spent years doing the work anyway, in rooms that weren't designed for them, at tables where their presence was conditional. This was not a small thing to have in common. The board presentation was on a Thursday morning in late February. Grant was not in the room. He hadn't expected to be. Board presentations at that level were not his domain, and Elena hadn't suggested it, and he hadn't asked. He was at his workstation in the operations center, working through a system architecture review for a new client project, and he was deliberately not thinking about what was happening 4 floors above him. Quan appeared at 11:45. How'd it go? Grant said, without looking up. Quan had his sources, a fact Grant had long since accepted without examining too closely. She held the room, Quan said. 2 board members pushed back hard on the liability framing, exactly like she predicted. She had the data response ready for both. And they tabled it for further review, which is not a no. Grant looked at him. For that board, with that proposal, tabling for review is approximately as close to a yes as you get in a first presentation, Quan said. My read is that it passes in 60 days. Grant went back to his screen. You don't seem surprised, Quan said. She's good at what she does, Grant said. That's not a surprise. Well, The proposal passed in 53 days. Heartline's new talent acquisition framework eliminated the mandatory 4-year degree requirement for 41 of 67 technical roles, replacing it with a competency assessment process that Elena and Grant had designed together. Skills-based evaluation, structured problem-solving exercises, portfolio review for candidates who had built their competence outside formal education channels. The announcement went out internally on a Tuesday morning, a company-wide communication from Elena that was direct and clear and did not over-explain or over-apologize for the change, because Elena did not over-explain or over-apologize for things she believed were right. Grant read it at his workstation. He read it twice. He thought about a Tuesday morning 2 years earlier, the alarm at 5:47, Owen's questions about roller coaster versus dentist nervous, the gray blazer pressed in the bathroom while a 7-year-old boy asked philosophical questions about shoe polish. He thought about walking into a building that was not designed to receive him, and sitting at a table while a man laughed and a woman watched, and he walked out with his folder of work samples still in his bag. He thought about the specific arithmetic of persistence, the way it doesn't add up cleanly, the way it costs more than it should and delivers less than you hoped, and then, sometimes, without announcement, delivers something you hadn't thought to ask for specifically, but that turns out to be exactly what you needed. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. Marcus picked up on the third ring, which meant he was at work and checking who it was before answering, which meant he'd answer in 12 seconds. 11 seconds. "What happened?" Marcus said. "Nothing dramatic, something good." A pause. "How good?" "The kind that takes a while to explain." "Come for dinner," Marcus said immediately. "Bring Owen. I'll make something with pastry." The Innovation Conference was Elena's idea, and it was larger than Grant had expected. Heartline hosted it in late April, opening the event to industry partners, clients, and, deliberately, specifically, candidates and applicants who were considering careers in the technology sector. It was part conference, part demonstration of the company's new direction. And it was the kind of thing that generated coverage in trade publications and a moderate amount of attention from people who followed talent development practices. Elena spoke for 20 minutes. Grant had read 3 drafts of the speech and argued with her about 2 sections, and the final version was better than any of the drafts because she'd taken what was useful from his pushback and ignored what wasn't, which was her consistent pattern and which he'd stopped finding surprising. She talked about the credential assumption and what it cost. She talked about it with the specific honesty of someone who had her own version of being filtered out before being heard, without making it a performance of personal struggle. She stated it plainly, the way she stated most things, and let it sit. She said, "The best hires I've made in 2 years include someone who taught himself data architecture at a kitchen table at midnight while working warehouse shifts and raising his son alone. He was almost never in this room. That would have been a significant and entirely preventable loss." He was sitting in the 3rd row. He hadn't known she was going to say that specifically, and he felt it in the particular way you feel things that you weren't braced for. Not overwhelmed, just present, the way something lands when you're not holding yourself against it. Owen was in the audience, too. Grant had brought him, which Elena had suggested and which he'd thought about for a week before deciding yes, that it was the kind of thing a 7-year-old boy should see. Not because it was his father's moment of validation, but because he was at an age where the shape of possible futures was still being formed. And it was worth showing him that the shape was wider than it appeared from the outside. Owen was sitting beside Marcus 2 seats down from Grant, and Grant glanced at him now. At his son in a collared shirt that he'd agreed to without complaint for the first time in his life. Gerald absent for once, watching the stage with the focused attention he gave to things he understood were important. He caught Grant looking at him and gave him a small nod. Very grave, very deliberate. Then he went back to watching Elena. Grant did the same. After the formal program ended, there was a reception, the standing around with drinks kind that Grant was not naturally comfortable with but had learned to navigate. Not to love, not to perform ease he didn't feel, but to be present in without the discomfort being visible or consuming. He stood with his water glass and talked to the people who came to talk to him, answered questions about the talent framework and the Arden project and what it looked like to build analytical skills outside of formal education, and was honest in all of it without making it a speech. A woman in her late 20s found him near the end of the reception. She had the specific look of someone who had prepared to say something and was now deciding whether to say it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, I'm sorry to interrupt. You're not interrupting. What's on your mind? She looked at him with the directness of someone who had decided to commit. I've been applying for data roles for 14 months. I have an associate's degree and 2 years of self-taught experience, and I keep getting filtered out before the first interview. She paused. I saw the announcement about the new framework. I wanted to say that it matters to someone who's been on the other side of that filter. He looked at her for a moment. Apply, he said. Specifically to Heartline. Use the competency pathway. Build your portfolio submission around the most complex problem you've solved, not the most impressive sounding one. The evaluators are looking for thinking, not vocabulary. She blinked. That's it? That's the most useful thing I know to tell you. He paused. The filter was wrong. It didn't mean you were wrong. Those are different things, and it's worth being clear about which one was which. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." And it came out quieter than she probably intended, and she walked away, and he watched her go and thought about all the people who were currently on the other side of a filter that had nothing to do with their actual capability, sitting at kitchen tables at midnight, building something real in the dark that no one had yet asked to see. There were a lot of them. That was both the problem and, in a way that was hard to articulate cleanly, also something like a source. The knowledge that capability was not scarce, that it was only hidden, and that the distance between hidden and visible was not always as far as it looked from the outside. He had covered that distance. He intended to spend some portion of the rest of his professional life making it shorter for other people. Owen found him 20 minutes before the end of the reception, materialized at his elbow with a plate of conference food he'd been cataloging with scientific interest. "These are good," he said, indicating something on the plate. "These are bad." He indicated something else. "These are okay if you're hungry." Noted. Owen stood beside him and looked at the room, at the clusters of people, the conversations, the particular contained energy of a gathering that was winding down. "Elena's speech was good," he said. "Yeah. She talked about you." "I know." Owen was quiet for a moment. He had his thinking face on, the slightly inward look that meant something was getting organized. "Dad." "Yeah." "The part about the kitchen table, the midnight part." He was looking at the food on the plate rather than at Grant. "I didn't know you were doing that when I was asleep." Grant looked at him. "You were little. I didn't want you to worry." "I wouldn't have worried." A pause. "Maybe a little." He looked up. "I would have stayed up with you." Grant felt something move through his chest that he didn't try to name or manage. "I know you would have," he said. Owen went back to evaluating the food. "It's good that you did it, though, the midnight studying." "Yeah." "Even though it was hard." "Even though." Owen nodded once, the verdict delivered, and offered him the plate. He took one of the good ones. He drove Owen home that night, and Marcus came with them. A spontaneous decision, the kind that got made in the easy shorthand of long friendship. And they made dinner at Grant's apartment, the three of them in the kitchen that had been, for 3 years, a place of late-night solitude and quiet work, and the particular company of a sleeping child in the next room. It was a small apartment. The radiator made it sound. The east-facing windows were dark now, the good morning light hours away. Owen fell asleep on the couch before 10, which he would have strenuously denied was possible at 7 in some months. And Marcus and Grant sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of dinner and talked the way they talked when they weren't performing anything for anyone, in the loose, unhurried register of two people who had known each other long enough that the silence was comfortable and the sentences didn't need to be finished. "You seem different," Marcus said at some point. "Different how?" Marcus considered. "Less like you're bracing for something." He turned his coffee cup on the table. "You've been bracing for something since Dana left. That particular tension." He looked at Grant. "It's not there the same way tonight." Grant thought about this. He thought about the specific quality of vigilance he'd lived in for the past few years, the constant low-level monitoring of stability, the way he'd gotten used to holding himself ready for the next thing that would require all of his available resources to handle, the way readiness had become his default state, because unreadiness had cost him before. He thought about whether that was gone. "Not gone," he said. "Different." Marcus nodded. "Different is good." "Different is honest," Grant said. "I'm not naive about it. Things are better than they were." Things can get hard again. That's just how it works. But right now, Grant said, is good. Marcus raised his coffee cup. Grant raised his. They didn't say anything else about it. They didn't need to. Hoptam. He checked on Owen before going to bed. The same ritual he'd performed every night since Owen was 18 months old in a crib, calling out in a two-syllable cry. The most consistent act of his adult life. He stood in the doorway in the low light and looked at his son, sprawled on the couch with a throw blanket that Marcus had pulled over him, Gerald retrieved from somewhere and tucked under one arm. 7 years old. Almost 8. At an age where the world was still wide enough to contain everything and narrow enough to feel safe. And Grant's job, the only job that had ever mattered completely, was to preserve that feeling for as long as he honestly could, while also preparing Owen for the reality that the world did not sort itself by fairness, that you would encounter rooms designed to exclude you, that the distance between what you were capable of and what people assumed you were capable of could be enormous and could remain enormous for a long time. He wanted to tell Owen something about this. Not tonight. Tonight was sleep, was Gerald, and the throw blanket, and the last piece of conference food that had been deemed acceptable. But eventually. In the way you tell your kids the things that cost you something to learn, hoping the transfer reduces the cost for them, even knowing it doesn't eliminate it. What he wanted to tell him was this: the measure of a life is not in the rooms that let you in. It is in the work you do while the doors are closed, because the work is real whether anyone sees it or not. And real things accumulate, and accumulation has a way of eventually becoming visible whether the door opens or not. The door had opened, but the work had been real before it opened, and that was the thing that mattered. The only thing that could not be given to you by someone else's opinion of your value. The only thing that Pruitt's laugh and 12 years of credential filters and one badly lit conference room in a glass tower could not touch. He'd built something, not in spite of the difficulty, alongside it, because the difficulty was the condition, not the obstacle, and there was a difference between those two things that had taken him 32 years and a lot of midnight hours to understand properly. He went to bed. He didn't set the alarm right away. Let himself lie in the dark for a few minutes, which he rarely did, usually moving from the moment his head hit the pillow to the efficiency of sleep. But tonight he lay there and looked at the ceiling and let the day exist in his mind without trying to organize it into anything. The conference, Elena's speech, Owen at his elbow with his food assessments and his gravity, the woman with 14 months of filtered-out applications, and the look of someone who had prepared to say something important. Marcus at the kitchen table, the throw blanket over Owen on the couch. He thought about Elena Hart, who had sat at the head of a conference table 6 months ago and watched him walk out into a humiliation she had recognized and said nothing about, and who had spent 9 days thinking about it and then made a call, and who had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars from a wheelchair in a boardroom that had spent 2 years looking for reasons to doubt her, and who was one of the most rigorous and honest people he'd worked with in his life. He thought about how strange and specific the paths were that brought people into each other's lives. Not designed, not clean, full of wrong turns and closed doors and the specific kind of luck that only looks like luck in retrospect. That is, in the moment, just the exhausting accumulation of not giving up. He thought about what they'd built together in the past 6 months. Not just the talent framework, not just the art and fix, but the working relationship itself. The particular trust of two people who had each been underestimated by enough rooms to understand what accurate estimation looked like and to give it to each other without ceremony. He didn't know exactly what that would become. He had learned in the specific school of his own life to be cautious about knowing exactly what things would become. Things became what they became. You did the work. You paid attention. You stayed honest. He would stay honest. He would keep paying attention. He would be at pickup at 3:15. He set the alarm for 5:47, which was when it had always been, which was when it would keep being for a while yet, and he closed his eyes. Outside, the city made its sounds. The radiator made its sound. In the living room, Owen slept with Gerald under one arm and the calm completeness of a child who believed the world was fundamentally navigable. Not because nothing bad had happened, but because the person responsible for his safety had shown up every day without fail, in all the ways that counted. That belief was not an illusion. It was something Grant had built, one day at a time, in the only hours he had, with the only materials available to him. It was the best work he had ever done. And somewhere in the city, in an apartment on a floor that probably got good light in the mornings, Elena Hart was likely still awake, reading something, preparing something, running the calculations that the job required and that the job would always require. Carrying the particular weight of leadership and the older weight of having been told, in 1,000 small ways, that she was in the wrong room. She was in the right room. She had always been in the right room. So had he. That was the thing neither of them had needed to be told. They had simply needed to refuse, quietly and persistently and without much drama, to accept anyone else's answer to the question of what they were worth. That refusal was not a gift. It was not given to them. It was built the same way everything real is built, in the small hours, in the margins of harder things, with imperfect tools and imperfect hands, and the stubborn conviction that what you are building is worth the building. It was enough. It had always been enough. The alarm was set. Morning would come. He slept.